Welcome back. You're watching France 24 live coverage from Hong Kong, where it's just gone 1 a.m. as police move in to retake the Legislative Council, overrun by several hundred protesters. It was some 4 hours ago, at the tail end of a march on a day marking the anniversary of the 1997 handover of Hong Kong from the UK to China. It's been a tumultuous last month for the territory. On June the 9th, protests began over a bill to allow the extradition of political prisoners to the mainland. There were scenes of violence which are unusual for Hong Kong that took place on June the 12th. Since then, the chief executive, the Beijing-backed Carrie Lam, has been under pressure. And we've had several huge marches in the city, including one this Monday that was big earlier. Those inside the building, according to correspondent Charles Pellegrin, who was in there until just under an hour ago, many of them, well, some of the more radicalized ones, many of them young, some not even born when Hong Kong was handed over by Beijing, and many expressing a sense of desperation, they say, what with expressing a sense of desperation, the idea being that the international community wasn't paying enough attention to them. We're joined by Jean-Yves Collin, North Asia expert at the Asia Center here in Paris. Thank you for being with us.
Nice to be with you.
We were sort of anticipating that something like this could happen. There could be some big standoff on the Monday after the G20, a G20 where, well, Hong Kong was not mentioned.
No, not at all, I think. It was not on the agenda. And in a way, the G20 was almost overshadowed by the Trump-Kim meeting prospect and the meeting itself. So Hong Kong was far behind, I think, the people who were in Osaka.
Far off the radar in Osaka. At this point in time, what will the international community, how much will the international community weigh in on what's happening?
I think the international community will just watch what is going on in Hong Kong and will not certainly interfere with what can be viewed as Chinese domestic affairs. Chinese
domestic affairs. We're joined by Hong Kong-born Nancy Lee, a human rights activist. Thank you for joining us here. In here on France 24, and we're watching these live images right now. It's gone 1 a.m. Your reaction to what you just heard, that, well, the world will watch, but probably not do much more.
I don't understand your question, sorry.
Will there be any response, in your view, from the international community to what you're seeing?
I certainly hope so. There has been a big global lobby effort toward the G20 from all the Chinese communities in Australia, America, England, Germany, France. I certainly hope that there would be. It's not on the agenda. Hong Kong is not on the agenda because Xi Jinping said, I don't want Hong Kong discussed.
Your reaction to those several hundred protesters storming the Legislative Council?
I'm really scared. I'm terrified. The Hong Kong people, the young people's despair is real. In the space of 12 days, there have been 3 suicides. And these young people, they, two of them throw themselves off buildings that are in the most central part of Hong Kong. They want to make it as public as possible because one of them, the last words she wrote was, "My despair is real. There's no tomorrow."
We're joined at this point in time by 2 guests. One is a former Hong Kong correspondent for Radio France International and who witnessed that handover of 1997. Philippe Lecor is now senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. Thank you for joining us. I want to thank as well musician, producer, and activist Denise Ho, who joins us at this late hour from Hong Kong itself. Denise, you just heard Nancy Lee speaking. Your reaction to the storming of the Legislative Council, did they do the right thing, those young people?
Yes, hello. I was here since this afternoon at noon, and when I saw that there were people trying to go inside the Lechko, I was at the Victoria Park waiting for the rally to start, and I decided to come over right away because I just thought we need to protect the students who are here on this side. And so personally, I really agree with Nancy because the kids here, the young students, they are really desperate. And with the suicides that we have seen, it's really a very grim moment for these young protesters who have been trying their best these 3 weeks to get their voices heard from the government. And it's just not happening. So I think whatever actions that they sought to, it is a result of the government who is not responding, and they are just giving us the silent treatment. And I believe that this is really on their hands, including the suicides.
Giving the silent treatment, we heard a speech earlier in the day by the chief executive, Carrie Lam, in which she showed contrition. She talked about how the authorities need to listen more to the people. Did you have the feeling that she had learned lessons?
She is possibly listening to some of the people, but certainly not all of the people, especially the young people. She is absolutely not listening. And also, the four people that we lost, she has not addressed this issue either. And I think it is just outrageous that we have a government who just, they just respond in a very, I just don't have words for it. Like they have given a few statements and that was it. And all that time afterwards, she has been addressing to people, on the other side, well, probably, and not the people who are still on the streets fighting.
Sorry, may I add that Carrie Lam was presented with 4 demands, and these students, these protesters, are not asking for the moon. The demands include an independent investigation of police brutality and also the withdrawal of the extradition bill. And she said, I have the support of Beijing. I'm here to stay. For the 4 demands, it will be no, 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 and no. What kind of concession?
Isn't one of those demands, though, that she stepped down?
Yes. No, I did not include that. I did not include that.
No,
that does not sound like contrition to me.
That one.
Sorry.
Yeah.
They removed that one.
Yeah.
Denito, earlier we were speaking to people who were in Hong Kong, including our correspondent, saying it is a leaderless movement, and not everybody agrees on the best strategy forward. A lot of people were against storming the parliament, the Legislative Council building. And they're worried that those who did could face long jail sentences for doing so. Is it a big problem, the fact that not everybody agrees on the best way forward now and what to do next?
Well, comparatively to the umbrella movement, I think this is really an evolved protest and movement where people, even though when we don't agree, we let others do things that they think best. And so personally, I was there when, at night when they forced into the Lechko, I was outside. And of course, I am someone who prefers that we protest in non-violent ways. But I think, as I said just now, this is really all a result of Carrie Lam's ignorance to the people's voices. And so I think they are really at a very desperate and tipping point. And as an adult, I think we need to be here to just protect them, because when we have many people on the streets, that's when the police they don't have the grounds to use the tear gas and everything. And so just now I was among the crowds. This was where the people retreated at the last part, and they were using tear gas on us, even though nobody barged ahead to disperse us. And so, I was in the crowd and I saw how great our young people were. They were helping each other, and some of them, they just they gave me helmets, and so I don't believe that they are violent protesters. They are just trying to get their voice heard, and that was probably why they forced into the Let's Go. And I will be here to in support of the students as long as they will be on the streets.
Philippe Lecor, your reaction to Denise Ho's account of her day?
So, of course, I mean, I have a lot of respect for people who are on the ground, and myself, having spent 8 years in Hong Kong in the past, I know how hot things can get, and I feel extremely touched by what happened in many ways. At the same time, I'm just getting concerned about the new level of violence that we've seen, and where do we go from here? When you have a group of protesters entering the Lechko building, that is obviously not going to be taken very well by the government. And when you go into violence, you reach a new step. So far there've been a lot of support from the international community vis-a-vis the sort of the pro-democracy movements, and especially the anti-extradition law movement, call it this way. They have a sense of symbolism, no doubt about that. Today is the 22nd anniversary of the handover from Britain to Hong Kong. And I find it interesting that the British Foreign Secretary has said that the UK will be supporting Hong Kong and the basic law and the joint declaration and all this. At the same time, he's been rebuked by China, who basically told him to look after his own business. So, the problem is, how much can we actually do? Withdrawing the law is fine, and at the moment it's only suspended. But it seems that people are now fighting for the autonomy of Hong Kong, for what's been sold to them in 1997, which means the directly elected Lechko, an independent rule of law, freedom of the press, all this. And all these things have been sort of taken away from them since, especially for the past 6 or 7 years. And the umbrella movement was obviously the first sign of people getting tired of this situation. But it hasn't improved at all in the past 5 years. So the problem is, by using violence, it attracts a lot of interest, a lot of attention, but it doesn't necessarily help the case of.
So let me ask you on that, Philippe. Let me ask you, what does Beijing do with these images? Do they make political hay out of them and publicize them as widely as possible to try to discredit the movement and say, oh, look, they're violent? Or because, well, there isn't much coverage of what goes on in Hong Kong on the mainland, do they sit on them?
At the moment, they sit on them, but it's quite possible, propaganda, as we've seen for the past few weeks, has been quite astute. For example, when there was a big demonstration on June the 12th, the Chinese media were reporting that these people were protesting against foreign interference in Hong Kong affairs. So, it's quite possible that we're going to see a lot of that. Similar to what happened after Tiananmen Square in 1989 in many ways. So that's the problem. And the Chinese population as a whole is not, I would say, in majority supportive of what's happening in Hong Kong. It's a Hong Kong matter, and the mainland doesn't really understand. And although I'm sure some people support the movement, so the question is, it's becoming a matter of faith for the Chinese government as well as for the Hong Kong government, how to handle a situation which is now becoming like chaos.
We're seeing images now inside of the Legislative Council, the police moving in. Earlier, our correspondent, Charles Pellegrin, when he left the building about an hour ago, was reporting to us there were just a couple of dozen protesters still in the chamber, and well, more journalists really than protesters who were inside. And as we see those live images there, Nancy Lee, your thought about how, well, the images of the violence could backfire dramatically for international sympathy for the movement.
Okay, I would call it force and not violence. As of 8 o'clock Hong Kong time, there's a strange setup going on in Hong Kong. The police has withdrawn from the LegCo, Legislative Council. The protesters are there all alone. And that's not been the case. The police has been very forceful throughout. But suddenly today, it withdrew. It is absent from the Legislative Council.
So it's a calculation, you think, on their part?
It smells bad, doesn't it?
Let the more radical ones go in, break things, and then
Right.
we'll advertise that.
There was some vandalism. They also picked what they destroyed. They destroyed all the portraits of the past Legislative Council presidents, that kind of thing. It's terrifying. I agree with Philippe Lecoeur that where do we go from here if once violence really starts? On the other hand, there's been an extraordinary pacifism that you don't see anywhere else in the world, where with the demonstration of 2 million people, afterwards the demonstrators clean the streets. Tell me one demonstration in France where the demonstrators clean the street afterwards.
Good luck with that. Denise Ho, let me ask you your thoughts on going back on the events of today, the fact that at one point the police did withdraw from outside the LegCo.
Yes, obviously, I agree with Nancy again. I think it was set up to incite these young protesters to go into the LegCo. Since they were here, the police were here this morning, and then suddenly they turned off the lights, and then they were gone. And so for almost an hour or so, or even longer, they just let the people go into the LegCo. And it's just not a very normal way if the police weren't expecting the people to go in. And so, and personally, I think, well, from what I saw, I was not inside, but from what I saw, these young people, they were quite restrained. You could see I saw this photo of a sign in front of the library in the LegCo, and they told the people to not destroy the books. So obviously they were there only to get their voices heard. I don't think that they were violent to just be violent. It was really a desperate act to go inside. So I really think that the people in Hong Kong, we should not condemn these protesters. We should still be condemning the government, who are obviously using and upgrading their tactics to hope for errors in our camp. And this is just not acceptable if a government is so against their people.
All right, I want to welcome at this point in time Théo Clément, Research Associate at King's College London. Thank you for speaking with us.
Hi.
When the day began, we had called you up, as was Jean-Yves, to talk more about the historic handshake and at the border between the two Koreas. We'll talk about that in a moment. But first, looking at these live images as they enter the Legislative Council, you heard earlier Philippe Lecoeur talking about international reaction, China wagging its finger at the UK particularly on this, the anniversary date of the 1997 handover. Now, we had a tweet earlier from the UK Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, who's currently running for the leadership of the Conservative Party. He said, quote, "Away from campaigning, want to stress UK support for Hong Kong and its freedoms is unwavering. On this anniversary day, no violence is acceptable, but Hong Kong people must preserve right to peaceful protest exercised within the law, as hundreds of thousands of brave people showed today." Of course, as we were talking about earlier with Jean-Yves Collin, Hong Kong did not come up in conversation, it seems, during that G20 summit.
Well, Hong Kong is basically considered China's backdoor. It's a bit difficult for Hong Kongers not to raise their voice and to speak out against Beijing or pro-Beijing. It's obviously a very tense situation. Obviously, the international community does not want to anger Beijing, so it kind of makes sense not to have, especially Western countries, putting on a fight with Beijing during the G20.
During the G20, and we've had these discussions over one of the points that was the build-up to the G20 was the liberal order. Is it in jeopardy or not? Rule of law versus strongman rule, and Hong Kong was used as this illustration of one of these places where this battle was playing out.
We might be tempted to read it as some kind of rule-based government, pro-rule-based government, Western liberal democracy against more authoritarian rule. But maybe we shouldn't read too much into the specific case of Hong Kong and maybe wait for further development of this specific issue.
All right, on a visit to Mongolia's capital, Donald Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, taking aim at Beijing. Let's take a listen.
I think our policies on Hong Kong and Taiwan are very well known, and in particular with respect to Hong Kong, we expect China, like every other country, to adhere to its international obligations. I think that's very clear.
Philippe Lecor, your thoughts on what we heard from John Bolton? And I guess I always have to preface it with the question, does he represent the views of the President of the United States?
Now, what was he doing in Mongolia when the president was on the demilitarized zone of Korea? Anyway, so
he got lost.
I think obviously the U.S. has had, the Trump administration has had a very strong stance on Hong Kong, welcoming the founder of the Democratic Party, Martin Lee, a few weeks ago in Washington, and that also annoyed Beijing a great deal. Having said that, what can the international community do? Except publicizing, mediatizing this situation. There is an agreement between the UK and China, which I mentioned earlier, which needs to be respected, implemented. So that's why the UK's view is welcome, and the US has the weight maybe to speak out. Having said that, the Trump administration, if I can go for a minute into domestic politics, is now facing re-election in the US next year. Donald Trump is facing re-election, and he's now putting on the table, when he's talking to Xi Jinping, all kinds of things, from trade to Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, the South China Sea, reciprocity, technology, which make it very confusing. And the messaging that is coming out of the White House on things happening in Asia is very disturbing sometimes. And you've just pointed out that the National Security Advisor, who is in Ulaanbaatar right now, or who was yesterday anyway, and since when has he taken an interest in Hong Kong? It's new to me.
Jean-Yves Collin, there was this idea going into that G20 summit in Japan over the weekend that everything was just leverage in the trade war between China and the United States.
Well, I think it's basically between China and the US. There are mainly three big issues: trade, technology competition, and competition, military strategic competition in the Pacific Ocean. All the other things are, in a way, cards to be used by one negotiator and another.
So that holds for Hong Kong, Taiwan, North Korea?
I think so. The main issue for the US is the competition from China in view of business and technology and military power. The rest is, in a way, is secondary. And even somehow the Korean issues is are not as important as the first ones, I would say.
You heard the way it was framed there, Denise Ho. When you look at the international community, do you look first at the UK or the United States or the European Union? Who do you look at?
Well, all of them, really, I think. UK, of course, they have a very big responsibility in this moment where we are still not having the universal suffrage that they and the Chinese promised us back in 1997. And so I think they do have a responsibility because we were their colony and they did not implement the universal suffrage when we were their colony. And so afterwards, I think that is still a declaration that is, within the international world. It's something that is not only with Hong Kong and China. And of course, the US, we were addressing them too, because we have that policy act that is still in place, and which, with this situation right here in Hong Kong, where the government, they just cannot govern anymore. And also with the extradition bill that is not withdrawn, it's just suspended, I must remind everyone, because the suspension means that they can pick it up any time that they want later on. So with all these facts, I think, of course, the European Union and also the United Nations, they also should be looking at these issues of the excessive force in the police, and also the one country, two systems that is obviously not working anymore.
Nancy Lee?
Yes. Actually, I idealistically look to Europe to do more for Hong Kong, because the European countries are a much better example of democracy than, if I may say, the US.
How so?
The US has its obvious problems of democracy, and when Martin Lee and his colleagues went to Washington, many people in Hong Kong expressed their resentment. So I want to remind everybody.
Why did they express resentment?
That Martin went to this one country that is not a good example of democracy. On the other hand, Martin cannot go to Beijing. Martin cannot go to China to properly represent his people. Well, allow Martin to go to China. Let him go present his case in Beijing. Why is he persona non grata in his own country?
We can cross live now to France 24's Charles Pellegrin. We're watching live images, Charles, of the police inside of that legislative council where you were a short while ago. It seems as though that occupation, can we say it is officially over?
Yes.
I can't say for sure that it's officially over, but the police...
Go ahead, Charles.
Sorry, I'll keep going there. I can see from here. It seems like it's definitely on its way to be over. The police on the north entrance is still waiting in a semicircle outside the entrance, while inside some other policemen are clearing the building room by room, but it's definitely towards the end of that process. It's unclear whether or not, for me at least, there are still protesters inside the building as we speak.
You were witnessing the tear gas being thrown as parts of the surrounding areas around the Legislative Council were cleared some 90 minutes ago. Describe the scene outside right now.
Well, right now it's eerily quiet considering how raucous it had been all day. Indeed, there were thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people around the Legislative Council chanting slogans and helping provide some of the protesters inside the Legislative Council with supplies, whether it's water or food or makeshift barricades or shields. And now it's eerily quiet because the police has done a very efficient job of clearing clearing the area with these quick runs towards the protesters and using, obviously, tear gas. It was really a matter of minutes before they cleared the area around, and then they did this slow siege, really, of the Legislative Council building, and now doing that clearing of the building room by room.
Charles, we have Denise Ho in Hong Kong and Nancy Lee here on set, who were raising the question of why the police appeared, according to them, to, well, withdraw slightly, enabling those more radicalized of the young protesters to enter the building in the first place. What did you witness personally?
It was definitely strange. It signified a change of approach compared to the previous protests, especially June 12th, where there were quite a few instances of police brutality, where the Hong Kong police really didn't hesitate to use force against those protesters. And you'd think that in a scenario where protesters are actually trying to break in Hong Kong's parliament in such a serious, important institution with heavy symbolism, that they would react more strongly. Now, there are some people who are floating the idea that some of these protesters could be actually Chinese agents trying to give protesters a bad name. But it also could be simply that police wanted to avoid two violent scuffles between police and protesters on the day of the handover. Indeed, this morning, Carrie Lam gave a speech where she explained that she was now open to dialogue and she was going to listen to the Hong Kong population, even if she didn't cave in to any of their demands. So perhaps this change of strategy from the police, what came from orders from the top, came from this change of approach from Carrie Lam, this change of tone, this reconciling tone. Perhaps it was just a way to not make waves on the day of the handover. However, this went way further and made bigger waves than they could even imagine. It's still very unclear at the moment and too soon to draw these kinds of conclusions. But it is clear that the police acted differently tonight than they did in the previous weeks, indeed.
Sean Pellegrine reporting live outside the Legislative Council, and we're seeing images now inside of the chamber, Nancy Lee, with the chamber which is quiet. Inside, we see some of that graffiti that's been on the walls, those portraits that were put up inside of the chamber. Tell us what those portraits are that were put up by the protesters.
I can't see any.
We saw them a minute ago, portraits of some of the, maybe Denise Ho, you can tell us.
Yeah.
That you can see them now there. If we go to the images from inside of the chamber, we can show those now.
Well, I can't really see your images, but I assume these are the portraits of the Legislative Council chairmen from the past year. Is that it?
Yeah.
Yes.
And but interestingly, they blacked out two of them, but one that is the middle. I remember that they did not destroy that one, and he was the chairman who was comparatively more reasonable. Sometimes he would be saying things for the pro-democratic side. And I'd like to add something to what was just mentioned just now, where I don't think it was the police that cleared off the spaces very fast. It was really the protesters. Their strategies have changed along these 3 weeks, where in the beginning, on the 12th of June, they were going hand in hand into the police. But this time, we know how to retreat in a very quick way, and to avoid casualties and to avoid anyone being arrested. So that was the reason why the space was cleared off within 10 or 15 minutes. And I am very proud of our protesters for their ways, their evolving tactics, and how they are protecting each other along the way. They are really high quality youngsters. I have to say that.
All right. Théo Clément, I just want to ask you, as we see those images inside the chamber there, and it's a reminder of the spike in tension in Hong Kong, and at the same time, the whole world was paying attention until a few hours ago to the détente we witnessed in Panmunjom, the truce village between the two Koreas. Donald Trump, the first U.S. president ever to set foot on North Korean soil. What are your thoughts? Was it just a photo op that and?
Well, clearly, I mean, you're right to point out that these are very historic times for Asia. Not only what's going on in Hong Kong, as we see right now, but also what happened no later than yesterday at the DMZ, at the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. Donald Trump called out Kim Jong-un for organizing an impromptu summit just at the peace house between North and South Korea. Kim Jong-un accepted the offer, and they've made this, I'm going to call it a mini summit, very short summit. They had a 1 hour long conversation. I don't think they went very far on the issue of denuclearization because you need to have working level talks. You need to figure out the technical details.
They agreed to rekindle talks.
Yeah, but which is very positive. I mean, I'm among the optimists. People have been saying that it's just a follow-up. I clearly don't agree. I think we don't need to focus on technical issues in denuclearization right now. I think we need to focus on how to fix the US DPRK relation, create and generate the minimal amount of trust that would make an eventual agreement on denuclearization sustainable and lasting.
You agree with that? Are you also one of the optimists, Jean-Yves Collin?
A bit less optimistic. I think what we have seen yesterday is mainly an excellent show of communication for both of them. For Kim, because he managed to present himself as a counterpart of the main leaders of the world. Donald Trump 3 times, Putin recently, Xi Jinping 2 weeks ago, and maybe the Prime Minister of Japan in the fall. And for Mr. Trump, it is true that he set a foot in North Korea, but after that, he himself declared that he has plenty of time, he's in no rush. And secondly, Mr. Pompeo, the State Secretary, said that the sanctions remain to be set on place and to be firmly implemented. So the only positive point is that it keeps the working level discussions live, and it will start again in maybe late July or something like that. I think that's the main positive point of the real point. The rest is communication.
When you look at North Korea, Théo Clément, because you have those, 24,000 U.S. forces that are permanently... 28,000, permanently stationed since the Korean War, since 1953 there. Is this, we were asking earlier when it came to Hong Kong, whether it was a UK problem or a US problem. When it comes to North Korea, is it squarely between those two nations, between Pyongyang and Washington?
Well, of course, South Korea has to be a player in the discussions. And if we talk about providing security guarantees to the DPRK, to North Korea, we might have to involve China, who is a signatory of the peace treaty that was signed the ceasefire that was signed in 1953. So it's not only North Korea and the US, it's not only North and South Korea, it's also we need to develop a wider security architecture in Northeast Asia. It might actually involve, as Jean-Yves pointed out, Japan at some point, who has felt legitimately threatened by the North Korean missile and nuclear programs.
All right, the move, Philippe Lecor, that Donald Trump's move across the border, it was noted as positive by Beijing. Has this been a good weekend for China?
Well, I have to say first, in reaction to what my co-panelist just said, I'm even less positive than Jean-Yves Collin. I think Donald Trump has made many foreign policy mistakes, but this is probably one of the biggest. To give credit to this regime by stepping into the North Korean side of the DMZ is really not a good idea. And as we know, the Pyongyang regime will remain a nuclear power, will remain a dictatorship, and will continue to oppress its people. And by giving Chairman Kim, as he's called, a chance like this to have this kind of publicity around the world is not well thought of, I'm afraid. As far as China is concerned, well, remember Xi Jinping himself was in Pyongyang 2 weeks ago, and he has met Chairman Kim 4 times. So over the past year and a half, which means China is not going to go away when it comes to the Korean Peninsula discussions. So what Trump has been trying to do is to engage with North Korea on a one-to-one basis, but he doesn't really manage to do that because of Russia, because of China. And back to your question, Francois, earlier, about the new international order and the strong man and all these issues. It's true that we are now facing with major blocs and a Sino-Russian very strong cooperation in many parts of the world, but particularly in Asia, which is difficult to counter even when you're in Washington these days. And I don't think North Korea is going to go along the United States without taking advice, to say the least, from Beijing.
All right, before we let you go, Denise Ho, because it's very late where you are. It's 1:42 a.m. and tomorrow is a working day in Hong Kong, or today rather is a working day, I should say, where you are. Let me just ask you. We're talking about geopolitical leveraging the way the world order is changing in your part of the world. There's something you mentioned last time, and then here I'm speaking to the artist, which is a soft power. Hong Kong may only have 7 million people, but you certainly have your own culture, as you've proved through your own music.
Yes, you are right. I think we have to acknowledge the fact that we are part of the world, and I think that would be what will be keeping Hong Kong going, the young people going on. Because if we look at things very closely in the very restricted angle, where we only look at Hong Kong, then I can understand the desperation, the despair that they're feeling. But if we look at a bigger picture, I believe that we are making some changes that are very important, namely the effect that the crowds on the street are having on the Taiwanese elections coming in the next year, the beginning of next year. And I believe that is something that is very, very important to the Chinese government. And as long as this will be going on still, I am quite sure of that. And as long as we are still going strong, I believe that change will happen somehow. And the young protesters, they are still leaderless, still creative. So hopefully, we have all the international press on the eyes on us, and that would help a great lot too. Yeah.
Denise Ho, many thanks for joining us here on France 24.
Thank you so much.
I want to turn to you, Nancy Lee, and pick up on something Philippe Lecor said about, the whether or not the U.S. in its dealings with North Korea thinks it can have an influence on, on values, and because we're all wondering at what point North Korea opens up, just as we're wondering at what point perhaps Hong Kong shuts down. You heard from Denise Ho that she believes that Hong Kong can still resist that for the time being, but. Yeah, it's a battle for influence, but it's also a battle for values that we're witnessing in that part of the world.
It certainly is. Hong Kong is not China. It may be part of China on paper. Anybody who's been to Hong Kong knows that the people do not live a life of a Chinese. It's that simple. Hong Kong people are defending their existence and their soul.
And at this point in time, when you look, Théo Clément, at the way that G20 played out, and it played out basically to a large degree, along the terms of Donald Trump, which is more paying attention to those sideline one-on-one meetings rather than the big multilateral sessions where you had those 20 leaders, very far from the first G20s. This one-on-one approach, how's it going to play out? Does it play out in the favor of the West, or does it play out in the favor of China?
Well, it's a bit hard to know. I mean, obviously, the way Donald Trump and the US now engage with the world has made us cause some stir. People in Europe especially are keen to uphold what they see as a rule-based engagement, multilateral approach to diplomacy, as we've seen during the G20 and the agreement on climate change, for instance. You had basically 19 countries agreeing on the agreement, and only the US standing out. If the US is able to uphold such a strategy without alienating itself from its ally, it might actually work for the US, but I'm very doubtful, actually. I think when we were discussing about European democracy and liberal countries, it might actually not look as a very appealing example for developing countries, maybe not especially for the Chinese. So it might actually play in favor of Beijing.
Might play in favor of Beijing, but then again, Philippe Lecor, Beijing will always need a place like Hong Kong where there's more investor confidence at times than on the mainland.
Well, I mean, again, things have been changing. As you know, Hong Kong is now part of this Greater Bay region that includes most of Guangdong province, the southern province of China, as well as Macau, the special economic zone of Shenzhen, and all this. And a few experts have been saying, and a growing number of experts, I would say, that it's a way to dilute Hong Kong as an investment center, as an international platform. It's very much like a Chinese city now, and the only thing that makes Hong Kong different is the rule of law and the freedom of the press. I mean, these are not small feats, arguably. But from an economic point of view, I don't know how long Hong Kong can be sustained as an international financial center and economic center. Certainly in terms of production, everything is across the border. And now Shenzhen is becoming China's Silicon Valley, while Hong Kong, it can only watch, from across the border. I think that's been a smart way from Beijing to dilute Hong Kong's autonomy. And this is actually what this movement that we've been watching is about as well, is preserving Hong Kong as a standalone region.
Jean-Yves Collin, when you think back to 1997, again, it's this anniversary date of the handover.
I would say my first visit to Hong Kong was in '86. Mm-hmm. So I saw the handover. I was there at that time. And I was in the asset management business for a very long time. So we had a subsidiary in Hong Kong. My feeling has always been that in the long term, the Hong Kong role would decline. And faced to this situation, what could we do? We could be in Shanghai, because Shanghai was developing its financial hub, and we could reach the Chinese people whose financial levels were improving. And at the same time, we could be in Tokyo or in Singapore to keep, I would say, the financial.
So in that way, Hong Kong has done better than you might have thought at the time.
Yeah,
it's still the world's third biggest financial center.
I think so, because I was I would say in '86, '97, I was much more pessimistic than I would be right now. But somehow, in the very long term, I think the role of Hong Kong will decline as far as a port, as a financial center and a service center in favor of, I would say, the mainland.
Okay. Nancy Lee?
I would hate to see that happen, but I would have to agree with that. China hates Hong Kong's guts, is dying to replace Hong Kong.
Guts, isn't that a bit strong?
No, it's not too strong.
Doesn't like Hong Kong people?
No. It wants to replace Hong Kong, but it can't. Hong Kong is still relevant, but not for long, if this continues.
All right, we'll leave it there. I want to thank you, Nancy Lee. I want to thank as well Philippe Lecor for being with us from Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Théo Clément, Jean-Yves Collin, stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois. So just a quick look at how this story has been playing out on social media and on various online media. Obviously, very strong, very rich in images of a very dramatic a series of events today. So you can see here this photo in the South China Morning Post of one of the moments where metal bars were being used to force their way into the legislature. And indeed, Hong Kong Free Press was also charting that event as it happened. So the images, everything was being captured, obviously, on cameras and relayed via social media. So quite violent images. And we can see also inside the legislature, when it had been stormed, images as well of the sacking inside of symbols of various aspects of the infrastructure of the interior of the parliament. So all of that obviously is going to impact on public opinion, on the way in which the discussion is playing out online. These images will probably not do the protesters any favours, you could say, politically speaking. And you can see there were messages such as this going up as well about how the whole work of the legislature had been suspended, all of its public service, until further notice in the wake of these of what happened. Then there was a message from the protesters that was relayed at the same time as the storming of the legislature. This is a series of screen grabs taken by one of the journalists covering it, and it's the same, I suppose, talking points that have been we've been hearing for a while. Hong Kongers can no longer stand the injustice that is our government, etc., etc. Just to move on, I suppose, from then of course there were the images more recently of riot police taking back control and protesters being evicted from the parliament. Then, of course, there was the whole, I'll get back to that in a sec perhaps, but the discussion about whether or not this was intentional on the part of the authorities to allow this to happen. I'm going to try to find one tweet that mentions that. Hong Kong lawmaker Fernando Cheung said it was unfortunate that the protesters took police and government's bait and stormed inside the legislature. He feared that this can lead to a public backlash. And indeed, I suppose some of the images of the police retreating, you know, even if there were many protesters, it's kind of hard to imagine, I think, for many people observing this situation, that the police could not have prevented the parliament from being stormed. So that is one talking point online, and one, I suppose, element of speculation or debate that this could perhaps be in some way orchestrated to allow for a backlash. So I suppose lots more to say on that, Francois, but obviously figureheads of the protest movement also chiming in on social media throughout the day. Joshua Wong talking about how he had missed the last two mass demonstrations because he'd been imprisoned. This time I'm back, and a very strong note of defiance. Carrie Lam speaking directly to Carrie Lam, saying that this is our voice. Also defiance in terms of the imagery here. Of course, this is a Pooh Bear, which is used in China as a symbol of President Xi, much to the annoyance of...
I hear it's been banned on where it was for a while, at least.
That's right.
It's banned in China.
Often scrubbed from Weibo. Exactly. And then you can see Carrie Lam and others are being sort of depicted as on a leash, if you like. So, and Carrie Lam stepped down. So those images, that defiant tone, still very present on social media. And I suppose then a degree of speculation and questioning as to how this happened today and what might happen next, and if public opinion might shift.
Is this written in Mandarin or Cantonese?
I can't read it.
It's too small. Okay.
We could possibly zoom.
Well, the written language is the same, Cantonese or Mandarin.
Yeah. Maybe to finish with the Taiwanese foreign ministry, they've been consistent every time there's been a day of big protests, coming in with a very supportive voice towards the Hong Kong protests. So a real solidarity there between the people in the streets of Hong Kong and the Taiwanese foreign ministry. And that one is actually, some of those streets were even signed by the current foreign minister of Taiwan.
All right, many thanks for that, James Creedon. I want to thank our panel once again, and our coverage of events in Hong Kong continues on our website, France24.com.